So a lot of people don't know and may be surprised to hear that for a very long time, leading up to and after I became Catholic, I was a, quote, worship leader at Mass. I would lead a group, which we called a choir, but if we're being totally honest here, that was just a euphemism for what was actually a band. We were the house band who played music at Mass, and I was the leader of this group for many years. If you don't believe me, here's a picture of me doing my best Hillsong impression. Now, I'm somewhat prone to giving myself a hard time over my role in that participation in the life of the church, but in fairness, I didn't get any theological formation or direction from the priests at my parish about how to lead in music at Mass. And in fact, I was recruited into that role even before I was confirmed as a Catholic. I was a music leader in the church for years before I ever got used to just attending Mass and seeing it from the other perspective. So when we started having kids and my wife needed me more in the pew, I took a step back from music ministry and started to gain that much needed perspective. One thing that stood out to me was this jarring experience of being attentive to what was going on in the Mass and in the sanctuary specifically, to having that interrupted by what often felt like a mere musical performance. For example, something we did all the time when I was leading music at Mass was replacing the psalm between the Old and New Testament readings with a song that had vaguely similar lyrics. And I remember seeing this from the other perspective once, where it felt like the Mass had stopped so that the band could then do a musical performance. And we always told ourselves, this is not about performance, it's about prayer. But I think the reason we repeated that mantra so often is because the dishonesty of it needed constant reinforcement to prevent us from doubting it. The truth is, we were performing. We were taking center stage and drawing attention away from the Mass itself and towards our musical performance, or at least our presence right next to the sanctuary, while reassuring ourselves that this wasn't a performance. And I remember this one time watching from the pew as the readings ended, and then the band started playing a song that was not part of the text of the Mass. And I remember looking at the priest sitting there waiting for this song to end and looking around at the congregation who weren't really participating in any meaningful way with the song. Everyone was just watching and waiting through a performance of a song so that we could get back to Mass. And the replacement of the psalm or the gradual for a hymn is probably the most glaring example of what I'm talking about. But in reality, this goes on all the time at Masses where I live, and I expect throughout the rest of the world, where what's called a proper of the Mass is replaced with a song. So if you aren't familiar with that terminology, a proper or the propers are readings and prayers that vary from day to day based on the liturgical year. So for example, what we're all familiar with is the biblical readings. Those are propers. The psalm is a proper, but there are also propers like the introit or the offertory or the communion antiphon, which are actually part of the text of the Mass. But we don't often hear about this concept of propers or the propers themselves because they are habitually replaced with hymns, or at least what we call hymns. So for example, there's supposed to be a chant at the beginning of the Mass called the introit and another during communion, but instead we always just get a hymn placed there. So we're leaving out parts of the prayers, the actual prayers of the Mass, in order to have a song instead, which is a really serious liturgical abuse. You could argue that we're interrupting the Mass as it is written in the Missal in order to take song breaks. And what really made this poignant for me recently was seeing this clip that is getting passed around on YouTube of a Catholic priest celebrating the Mass in a warfront for his soldiers when an artillery attack suddenly breaks out on his position. But notice he doesn't run for cover. He doesn't stop the Mass. The blasts are so close to him that they are knocking over some of the vessels on the altar. The pages of his missal are blowing with each impact, and his hair is getting knocked out of place. And yet he keeps going. He doesn't stop. Some people might ask, why? It's because the church teaches that the Mass is a unified act of worship. Worship being that thing that we owe to God as a matter of justice, by virtue of who he is and what he has done for us. It's a matter of justice. We owe it to him. That's why during the preface to the Eucharistic prayer, the priest says, "Let us give thanks to the Lord our God," and then we say, "It is right and just." And in addition to being a unified act, it's an action of Christ and his body, the church. To disrupt or interrupt the liturgy with trivialities or actions or songs that we've deemed more important for some reason to the actions of the church or of Christ himself is to create a rupture in his good work of redemption. It's an extremely serious thing to do, which is why, as far as is possible, priests are trained to continue saying the Mass once it starts. So even if something is disruptive or a distraction takes place in the congregation, like say a person has a medical emergency or someone starts acting disruptively, the priest, as far as possible, is supposed to continue with the Mass. And again, I think that this is inculcated through their training. This is something they're taught is very serious. But we've somehow allowed certain kinds of disruptions and interruptions, especially these song breaks, to get smuggled into the liturgy and to not really care about it. And this resolve to refuse to allow these kinds of disruptions and interruptions is what's being depicted in that clip of the priest under siege. He continues to say the Mass, even though it means his own life is under threat. And when I saw that, all I could think of was the many, many times I've looked at what appeared to be a deflated, even defeated celebrant at Mass being undermined by lay people introducing their own novel ideas to the liturgy as he sits there waiting for the interruptions to end. What priests who were literally attacked while saying Mass wouldn't allow, we now tolerate on a weekly basis so as not to have to deal with conflict or to avoid offending people who want to use the Mass as a platform to elevate their own significance while they reassure themselves that it's not about them. And again, I'm speaking directly because I'm speaking from my own experience here. And had I not had the chance to see it from the other side, this other side being someone sitting in the pew, I probably never would have gained enough distance from my own ambitions in order to learn about what the church teaches about the liturgy without potentially being offended by it. And as I had that opportunity to study and learn more about the Mass, I realized I could never go back to that kind of worship leader role again. Even the fact that we use that kind of language is kind of startling. The worship that is offered at Mass is the sacrifice on the altar, and the leader of that worship is the priest offering the sacrifice. The only worship leader at Mass is the priest. At what point did we start supplanting his role by claiming the title worship leader for ourselves because we were singing some songs? I saw this recently at Mass in which people clapped at the end for the musicians, and then someone went to give an announcement and they reaffirmed that it's good that we should clap for the, quote, worship leaders. It kind of betrays a whole shift in mentality and emphasis that has taken place in the church, where songs and song singers have been given such a high place of honor that we will actually give them the title that is exclusively only appropriate for the priest offering the sacrifice. And we still describe the songs in terms that are only fitting to describe Christ's own sacrifice. Like the church used to have choir lofts at the back of the church where the choir couldn't even be seen in order to avoid this kind of displacement and distraction from the true meaning of worship. We've always believed and rightly taught that all of our focus and attention should be on the altar, on Christ himself made manifest for us in the sacrifice and in the sacrament. And imagine that being the centuries-old tradition, and then at one point, someone proposes, hey, I think the choir should be right next to the altar instead. Why would you propose that if it wasn't to draw more attention to the singers and musicians? There's simply no need for that unless they felt like the anonymity of their role was too much of a sacrifice to make. Like, why can't some of the attention be on the singers and musicians as well? How about because that will compete with the attention we should give to Christ on the altar? And yet, this is the norm everywhere today that is so familiar that you'd have a pretty serious fight on your hands if you try to suggest that the house band should be moved to the back of the church in most parishes so that they're not a distraction. So we've gone from a time which is fairly recent in our history in which priests were so disciplined in this understanding that they wouldn't suspend Mass even under an artillery barrage. We had such a strong understanding of the unity of Mass that we wouldn't tolerate interruptions to that act of worship. To today, when we routinely allow the Mass to be interrupted by announcements and extra liturgical activities and song breaks, songs that are not part of the text of the Mass and which replace the actual prayers of the Mass in certain spots. We describe cantors and musicians as worship leaders and the songs themselves as worship, even though the sacrifice of the Mass is the actual worship being offered and the priest the only actual worship leader. I know that seeing this clip of this priest and hearing similar stories of priests in war and the resolve they had to do liturgy correctly under extreme circumstances That gave me a profound sense of how important it is for us to do likewise, which is why I hope that we can find the resolve to call for a renewed sense of the role of music at Mass, which is to sing the Mass parts, sing the Mass themselves, or sing the Mass itself, not to sing songs at Mass in a disruptive and interrupting way, which is to avoid allowing musicians and singers to take the spotlight away from the altar where it belongs, whether that's intended or not, and out of that resolve, to encourage parishes to move singers to the back of the church where there won't be this risk of inflating the significance of their roles to the degree that it becomes an unavoidable distraction and a temptation to interrupt this sacred worship, which should never be ruptured whether by bombs or by inflated egos. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support, so if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.